Thank you very much, Helene, for that kind introduction, and thank you and Jean-Baptiste for inviting me to come here and give this keynote. I'll start out by saying I have a personal attachment to this area and to the STS department here at UCL. So as a young man during my university gap year, I came to London and worked for 6 months at a vegetarian restaurant down at Goodge Street. It was called Cranks. It's not there anymore, but some of you my age will not and recognize the name. And then later, as an early career scholar, I got a university fellowship to come to the STS department for 2 months. I was invited by Jane Gregory to come to this department, and I think this really sparked my interest in science communication and also got me to see that science communication belongs to the field of STS and can be taught from an STS perspective. So that visit in the end is what is now coming to fruition at Aarhus University, where we're starting up this new master's program. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what STS adds, and I'm going to mention 3 things: perspective, judgment, and the shaping of science and technology. And I'm going to approach these issues from my own perspective as a head of Center for Science Studies at Aarhus University, and talk a little bit about what are we doing and what are sort of the connections and the collaborations that we have at Aarhus University with other people at the university faculty and also a bit beyond. And as a head of Center for Science Studies, I quite often come across this question. So what exactly is it that STS adds, both in terms of research and in terms of education and in terms of other things that the university is engaged in? As Helene mentioned, we are located within the Department of Mathematics, and we changed from a proper department into a Center for Science Studies in the Department of Mathematics about 11 years ago. This is, by the way, some of those of you who have been to Aarhus University will recognize the yellow bricks that is very sort of prominent at the university, and one of my colleagues, a mathematician, Peter Jørgensen, and some of our students. And it's exactly this experience moving into a mathematics department that where, at social gatherings and other events, my colleagues in mathematics would come up and say, "What is it exactly that you do?" sort of. And they were curious, but also a bit, let's say, skeptical about the contribution of STS to a department of mathematics. And the same also for our students. We teach introductory courses in philosophy of science to all of the students at the natural science faculty and all of the engineering students. And we also quite often come across this, let's say, a bit skeptical attitude or questioning about what is it that this course will add to their study program. I will say that it has changed a bit over the years. I think in the mathematics department, I think maybe they've gotten used to us being around, but I think also because we have started out our research project in explainable AI, and this is also something that the mathematicians are struggling with. What is it exactly that you get out of these AI models, and how can you explain the outcome and what happens? So I think that can kind of generate a recognition, at least, that we can also add something to some of the topics that they're interested in. And I think so also in terms of the student population, I think also that I can see a slight change, and I think it has to do with some of the reforms that have been done in the Danish high schools, where students are more prompted to work interdisciplinary and also think about different methods from different fields and how they can support or perhaps even contradict each other in terms of tackling some of the challenges or projects that they are working on. So I think students are, that's my sense at least, they're a bit more prompted to think philosophically about what is it that different science approaches and different approaches to projects and topics can offer. I've also come to think that, so I can just reflect on 4 meetings I've had in the past 4 years where this question about what is it that STS adds to our work in the center does. A recent meeting in the Aarhus Space Center, so that's an interdisciplinary group for space research and engineering, where they have invited me and a few other fellow STSers into the steering committee. And we were discussing, what is the future of this space center? So how can we sort of position ourselves in the university politics, and what are the opportunities now that we are transitioning from a certain kind of network funding into a cluster funding at the university? So I'm not going to bother you with the details, only to say that I feel that we, coming from an STS perspective, can really help scientists and engineers also to see some of the institutional challenges and recognize some of the wider possibilities and constraints that a space center has. I'm also involved in the Quantum Campus Aarhus, which is again an interdisciplinary network at Aarhus University. And here the role is a bit different, because we're not part of a steering committee, or we're not helping to design the future, let's say, directions of the network. But we have a research group where we are looking into futures of quantum technology. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but here is an opportunity at least to offer new perspectives and new ideas about what is it that quantum technologies can do, not only for the researchers, but also for the wider society, and how can these perspectives also add into the existing research opportunities that the quantum scientists and engineers are facing. Another meeting last week at Aarhus University was about science diplomacy, and this is a completely different field compared to the two others, because here we interact more with scholars from economy, social sciences, political science, and I think this STS perspective can also add it to the traditions and the ideas about foreign relations and foreign policies that will have helped sort of shape the discussions around science diplomacy. And the last thing, you can really see it, it's a network for artificial biology, and here we are involved in a large center research proposal, because they want to do a center for the study of the origin of life, and they're approaching this from the molecular biology perspective, and here a historical perspective also on what have people in the past thought about origins of life, because they're really looking for new kinds of research questions, and the historical perspective on different ideas about origins of life and opportunities and research paths that we're not taking in the past will hopefully sort of feed into this new research proposal, and so we can sort of also add new ideas into this. So this has just happened in the past 2 weeks, where I think at least that STS has added something to my work. And so my general proposals or proposition today will be that STS, what STS adds is not only more knowledge about science and technology. We're producing a lot of knowledge studies around what is it science technology is, and what is it that they do, and how do they impact the wider society. But I think increasingly, from where I see it, is that we are also adding capacities that help shape what science and technology come. At least that's the role that I can see that our center is increasingly taking on, and being asked also by scientists and engineers to take on. And I will go through these different perspectives, because what I think what science and technology becomes, right? So what we can help science and technology become depends also on our common or collective ability to see different alternatives, to exercise judgment, and to connect different forms of expertise. And this is what I'll try to demonstrate with a few examples from my own research environment. Yeah, so perspective, I think that's perhaps the most easiest part. Because I think that it's pretty clear that STS can teach us to see that science and technology could be otherwise, simply by pointing out some of the perspectives that can be added on to science and technology developments. So we can talk about science and technology is not only about knowledge and innovation, but it's also about a lot of other different things. And again, I'm going to approach it from the sort of the networks and the collaborations that I'm involved in. I'm going to talk a little bit about space research and innovation. And what's happening in Denmark, and I think this is the same for many other small research nations, is that they are seeing new opportunities in the field of space research and innovation. So here's an excerpt from the new national strategy for Danish space research, innovation and technology development. And you can see they have these three different pillars with initiatives in science and technology, with initiatives in international collaborations, and initiatives and indicators for the innovation field, new ideas about commercialization of space technologies. And I think just looking at a document such as this one clearly shows that space research and innovation exist not in one, but in several social worlds at the same time. So it's not to say that we don't have to argue that science and technology is socially constructed. We can simply point out that there's a lot of social perspectives and ideas about science and technology and how it should and can evolve in different contexts that is embedded in a policy document such as this one. And so my science colleagues in the Aarhus Research Space Center, they would focus on, what are the opportunities for our kind of research, whereas what we can do is we can also say that we have to consider the whole field as such, and we have to consider that there are different perspectives that needs to be taken into account. And so concretely what we do is, of course, we try to add perspectives to what can be addressed, what can be talked about in relation to space research and technology. And this is an excerpt from a recent poster that we did for the Aarhus University Space Day, which was primarily a day for scientists and engineers and people in the space industry, right? But we thought, okay, we'll talk a little bit about some of the initiatives, specifically this new satellite that was sent up last year in a collaboration between Denmark and Sweden, the new Bifrost satellite, as a case of security science diplomacy. And I'm not asking you to read the fine print here, but simply to say that this is a satellite, this is a technological, innovation that promotes Earth observation and can be used by the scientists, of course, but it's also a satellite that enters into a security science diplomacy field where Denmark and Sweden is beginning to think about how can we ensure also security issues by ways of space science and research. And there's a discussion here about what is science diplomacy, what was it in the past, how is it evolving, and what does it mean when we add this security discussion to it. There's also a wider foreign policy discussion to be had around this Bifrost satellite that has to do with Denmark's Arctic dilemma, which is happening right now, of course, with the increased interest in Arctic issues, Trump's bid to take over Greenland, etc., where Denmark has to navigate sort of a very narrow path between, on the one hand, promoting a peaceful and sustainable development in the Arctic, while at the same time also thinking about security issues and its foreign relations to the United States. So this is the dilemma that the Arctic dilemma that this satellite is also sort of part of. Yeah. So the Bifrost satellite can be a case study, and this is, easily seen from a STS perspective, right? It's a case study about security, science, diplomacy, thinking about the diplomatic relations and also Denmark's role going forward in relation to Arctic policies. And I think this is an important perspective that needs also to be brought out and be feeded into the discussions around, what can we do in terms of space science and research going forward. So I would argue, here STS helps us see that Bifrost, the satellite, which is a both for it has peaceful uses, but it's also a military satellite for surveillance in the Arctic area. It can do both things at the same time, so a dual-use technology, if you like. And it's not only a system for observing the Arctic, but it's also a means of shaping Danish space research, security policies, and visions of the Arctic future. And we can approach this from a historical perspective, seeing how science diplomacy has changed or is changing from a role where trust building and cooperation between security towards security issues is becoming more prominent. Thinking about governance, how science, industry, defense, and government become linked through these technological practices. And finally, normatively, thinking about how Bifrost also embodies a choice between possible Arctic futures, not merely a technological solution to a predefined problem. So this is, how STS can sort of add perspective to these kinds of endeavors. In relation to quantum science and technology, as I mentioned here, the role of the Center for Science Studies is a bit different because we are part of this network. We're not sort of a part of the steering committee or the making the decisions. But I think here it's a field. It's a rapidly developing field where there is a lot of similar issues at stake compared to the space area. And here again, there's a lot of political documents. I just Googled and found the latest UK quantum strategy to give you an example of how these things are being articulated. And you can see that people here are talking very much about digital infrastructure, the advanced manufacturing base, driving growth and helping to build a thriving and resilient economy and society. These are the same kind of formulations that you can see in many of these quantum strategy documents from all over the world. In fact, in Denmark it looks maybe a bit different. We are perhaps not as subtle in simply saying welcome to Quantum Denmark, it's time to come to Denmark. So trying to invite, researchers and engineers to Denmark to help us build this quantum future. As you can see from this image, there's a lot of empty spaces, empty office spaces. So you can just come apparently here. Yeah, and the Quantum Europe strategy, I'll just highlight the 5 interconnected areas here you are very familiar with these kinds of policy documents, right? What they're focusing on is research and innovation, quantum infrastructures, strengthening the quantum ecosystem, space and dual-use quantum technologies. So there's an overlap here to the space area, and building quantum skills. You need new kinds of capacities, and you need really to enforce it, strengthen education in these kinds of areas. And again, it's relatively easy from an STS perspective to point out what is not here, what is missing from these kinds of documents, right? So questions about responsible research and innovation is not there. Questions about the assessment of technologies, the broader social and ethical and legal implications of technologies is not mentioned there. And this can be documented also on a grander scale. I came across this, actually 2 studies that I'm just going to show to you. This is a study of I think 24 different nations and how they've talked about quantum technologies from the early 2010s and up until today. And what they did here is they identified 4 different types of narratives around quantum technologies. One about the quantum state, which has to do with the national preparedness for developing quantum technologies. The quantum race, which is about technological advancements, and the quantum market, you can see that's about commercialization. And then the quantum readiness, despite the name, it's really a discourse around how does society, how is society prepared, you can say, what are the social implications of quantum technologies. And what is visible from this study is at least that the quantum readiness, the quantum and society discourse is relatively low on the agenda of such quantum policy documents and such quantum strategies. And what they also did, I think this is quite easy, they also looked at across different regions or countries. I don't know if you can read this figure, but you can see they have the 4 different quantum narratives down here, and then they have the different countries and the prevalence of these narratives in the different countries' documents. And I can just, so Denmark here is at the top of the quantum race, so there's been a focus very much on the quantum race in the Danish policy documents, right? And surprisingly, the US is down here with the highest degree of focus on quantum readiness in talking about the social implications of quantum technology. So that's also a way sort of STS can add perspective on what is being talked about in these documents and how do we frame the issue of quantum technologies going forward. And in another study by the same people, they look not at national strategies, but they look at media discourse around quantum technologies, trying to, or rather they looked at different domains. They looked at the media, they looked at businesses and policies, and were trying to figure out, I mean, how is quantum technologies being discussed in these different domains. And here again you can see, so here they have 5 different kinds of narratives at the vertical axis, and then at the horizontal axis they have different domains. And what is interesting to note here is the people and society discussions, which is fairly low in all 3 domains, but is mainly carried out in the media. So the media here seems to play an important role for furthering discussions around the people and society discourse around quantum technologies. And if you take sort of a temporal perspective on this is a rather complex mix of different figures, but I'm just going to have you look at the media discourse here, and you can see the people and societies out here in the far end. And what is happening here is that actually over time there seems to be sort of a decline in the discussion around consequences for people and society from the development of quantum technologies, which can of course mean many different things. It can mean that the media has kind of grown wary of this perspective. It can also mean that we are sort of moving from a Colin-Rich, I don't know if you know the Colin-Rich dilemma, which means that early on in the development of technologies, there's more scope for these kinds of discussions, and the more developed technologies become, the less discussion around what are the consequences of such technologies seems to be prevalent. And I think this can maybe explain some of the things that are happening here in the quantum and quantum technology field. So this is where we, in our group, would like to do something about the discussion, or at least try to intervene in the discussion around what is it that quantum technology can do and should do and will do for us in the future. So a couple of weeks ago we had our workshop here about building quantum futures, feeding very much on the discussion in the STS field around socio-technical imaginaries and how ideas about different technologies and their developments can also help us manage and steer these technologies in the future. And I think one of the discussions, or one of the things that we would like to do in this particular project is to open up the discussion around quantum technologies. I think it's not an easy thing because quantum technology is also a bit mystical for many people. They don't know exactly what it is and how it's going to impact them, and they can be reluctant also to discussing these issues. But in the course of this project, we are going to host different participatory workshops where we will at least attempt to open up the discussion around quantum technologies for other actors than the ones that are typically being asked about quantum futures. And again, STS can make a very simple, let's say, add-on, or can be used to add more perspectives on what quantum futures are, because quantum futures are made and they're not found, and the quantum strategies quite often imply desirable futures and align research, investment and governance through them. But if STS can help not only to identify those imagined futures and the political choices that they embody, but I think STS is also a field that can open up for the excluded possibilities. So thinking about questions such as sustainability and participation, equity and justice, because they remain largely absent from the discussions around quantum technologies at the moment. Or they're not entirely absent. I would like to point out here people who are also working in this field talking about responsible quantum technology. So researchers from the Stanford group on responsible quantum technologies have intervened in the discussion here. For example, in this paper in Nature Physics, where they are talking about different kinds of considerations and ideas from the fields of responsible research and innovation and ELSA perspectives on technology, and arguing that this can broaden up the discussion and the perspectives that we currently see on quantum technologies. And also at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, where they have a group on responsible quantum technologies, and they're doing great work, I think, from a technology assessment point of view. Right? So there are different traditions, of course, beyond STS that can open up these discussions. Technology assessments, technology scenarios are two such ideas, and they're working in the Karlsruhe group to think about new perspectives that can be thought about and can be included into the discussions around quantum technologies and the possible futures that we see in front of us and that we would like to develop when we think about quantum technologies. Okay, so I'm going to move from perspective. I think perspective is perhaps the easiest argument for this is STS, right? We can add perspective to current developments and current discussions around science and technology. But I'm going to talk also a little bit about judgment here and argue, and I will try to argue that STS also helps us acknowledge judgment as something that is needed within every science and technology field, but also something that needs to be cultivated in a certain way within science and technology. And I'm going to approach judgment. First of all, I'm going to say why judgment matters. So again, my argument would be that STS help cultivate reflexive judgment by examining assumptions, institutions, and cultures that shape decisions. Right, so we can think about what is the broader context in which decisions are being made, and that can help us inform and improve decisions. Principles and knowledge, they guide actions, but they rarely determine it. And STS helps us reveal those blind spots and taking for granted assumptions within established knowledge practices. And sound judgment is a collective achievement. So it's not something that is only made or contribute. It's not something that STS is the only contributor of, or the only, let's say, reminder of that judgment is needed, but something that I think we should do together with people in many other fields. And I'm going to approach it from the topic of research integrity, because I think it's a nice topic, but it's also something that we have been involved in at our center for several years, teaching research integrity not only to the undergraduate and graduate students, but also to PhD students. So in Denmark, as in many other countries, I think about 11 or 12 years ago, we had a new code of conduct for research integrity, It was decided on the national level, and then the universities were obliged to sort of carry it out. And I think from the management point of view, it was very much thought of as a kind of a compliance exercise, right? You have these new guidelines and this new code, and we need to sort of comply with it. And one of the things we do is to have mandatory teaching for all of the PhD students at the universities, for example, and also all of the faculties. But I'm involved in teaching all of the PhD students at the natural science and engineering science faculties, and so I can say a little bit about how judgment, I think judgment is a very key term for thinking about and also doing research integrity in practice. And I'm going to approach it, first of all, I'm going to take some examples from studies of research integrity to convince you or to argue why judgment is a key thing here. It's not only about principles and codes of conduct, it's very much about exercising judgment in practical and uncertain situations. So here's a study done by colleagues at the University of Copenhagen, and they've looked at academic integrity across educational levels, so exploring students' engagement with gray zone and non-compliant practices in European countries. And I'm just going to take out one result from this paper. This is where they asked students at different levels about different practices relating to data deviations and how you report on deviating data. And what they're trying to do is here that they, on the left-hand side, they have a practice where you replace. They ask the students about. They ask them. Well, first of all, they ask them: is this practice against the rule, or is it unclear if it's against the rules? And these are the. And is it not against the rule? And the white ones is yes, it's against the rules. It's a violation. And the first practice out here is clearly a scientific, or it can be close to falsification of data. Is when you replace deviating data with extrapolated data from your other results, and you don't mention it in your article. And so this is bordering on research misconduct, and you can see from an upper secondary level to bachelor levels to PhD level, the students seem to become more aware that this is a deviating practice and should be avoided. So they actually learn throughout their, let's say, student career, if you like. But then they have more gray zone practices. So this is not mentioning that you removed deviating data when the cause of the deviation was unknown. So this is not good science, I would say, because if you don't know about why the data deviated from what you expected or what you predicted, and you don't report it, then that's clearly a gray zone exercise, and you can see the students' responses are more or less the same, although there's a bit more uncertainty here at the PhD level. And then not mentioning that you removed deviating data when the cause of the deviation was known. This is something that you could argue that could be done in a responsible manner, because if the knowledge about why the data was deviating is completely known, that there are good reasons for taking it out, then that practice can actually be a sound practice. But it seems that the students here are less prone to say that this depends, right? So they're less. Even the PhD students here, they say this is clearly a violation, and they are less, they're less inclined to go into a discussion about when is this practice actually a good practice or sound practice, and when is it a bad practice. So I think this is where judgment come in, because we really want the students to recognize that there are clear practices that should not be done in science, but there are also a lot of gray zone practices where you really need to think about the specific situation and to go into sort of a context sensitive judgment about what is the right practice in this particular area. So I think the gray zone practices, they really reveal the limits of rules, right? The rules saying that this is good or bad, this principle should be followed or not followed, right? Because this is where you need to exercise sound judgment, and you need to think about the actual circumstances, and you need to think carefully about the situation that you find yourself in. And I think this is where I use STS in my teaching to PhD students. I think so. Instead of just saying that do we comply or do we not comply with the rules, we have to think about also in certain situations, when is it that non-disclosure is acceptable, and who decides and on what grounds. And I think this opens up for another kind of discussion with the PhD students in the research integrity courses. And I'm going to present you also with another study done by my colleagues at Aarhus University. This is a larger study of questionable research practices. The title, I really like the title here. It refers, of course, to Shakespeare's Hamlet, which is also a reminder that we're not looking here for the rotten apples in science, the people who conduct or scientific misconduct out of, let's say, personal reasons. We're talking about the structural, let's say, incentives and reasons why people would engage in questionable research practices. And what they did here is they surveyed a lot of researchers at Danish universities and international universities, and what they found was very much like other studies have found, is that questionable research practices are in fact quite widespread. So I don't know whether you can, I'm not sure, you can't see. So what you have here on the vertical axis is a list of different kinds of questionable research practices that comes and of different kinds of different degrees, you would say, from selective oversighting of own publications, citing literature without reading it, down to overselling results and salamicizing publications, etc. And what they did is they asked the researchers, have you or have you not engaged in any of these practices in your recent publications? And at the horizontal axis, you can see this is 50%. So for many of these practices, around 40 to 60% of all researchers admitted to having done such questionable research practices in their recent publications. And if you sum it all up together, it amounts to nearly 90% of all researchers admitting to questionable research practices in their recent publications. So in fact, it is quite widespread that researchers will admit to questionable research practices in their recent work. And what they also did is they asked a number of, let's say, background questions in order to see if they could find any correlations with some background variables to explain the results, or at least to argue what are the predictors for admitting to questionable research practices. And this is what these curves show. The Danish sample is on the left-hand side, the international sample is on the right-hand side. The percentage point down here describes the correlation with admitting to questionable research practices. So if you're over at this side, then there will be a positive correlation with more admitting to questionable research practices. And down over here, it's a negative correlation. So a negative correlation with admitting to questionable research practices. And there are some personality questions, a gender question, and an age question. I'm just going to focus on the two top one here about local culture. Local culture meaning a research culture in which research integrity issues are quite often discussed and openly talked about. A research culture that will encourage researchers to do responsible research practices and have an open discussion about what is it that we as a research community value and so on. And you can see a local culture obviously means less reporting of questionable research practices. And then they also have a question about perceived pressure. So a very simple question about whether you think you are in a pressured position as a researcher, pressure to publish more papers and pressure to attract more funding and so on and so forth. And that also has that has a positive correlation with admitting questionable research practices. So I think this study can be used also as a way to talk about let's say, the culture and the institutional setting in which research occurs, and for open up for a discussion also about what are the incentive structures for younger researchers, and how do we need to, let's say, manage this as at the individual level, but also at the research group level and at the institutional level. And I think the conclusion here is very much an STS conclusion, because they're talking about the exact same question, that thinking about questionable research practices is very much a judgment about what does it exactly mean in the specific context. So why did it happen, and who were involved? So I can just read out here. Whether a specific practice in a particular context is questionable is indeed questionable. It depends. This is likely one of the reasons why we see claims of widespread use or involvement in questionable research practices. It also raises important questions about the nature of questionable research practices and to what extent it's meaningful to categorize individual practices as being inside or outside a specific, a discrete category. And I think this is very much an STS question also about thinking about when are the binaries here between good and bad science, when are they being, and to what extent are they being, let's say, enforced or are they relevant at the specific level. Many such practices cannot unequivocally be classified as questionable in the problematic sense. They're context dependent. The view of them can change over time, and the degree of questionability and severity are subjects to perpetual discussions within and between research communities. So I think this kind of, let's say, nuanced discussions about when do we judge certain practices to be within a certain category and what happens if we do so is a very much an STS related conclusion. And I think STS can also, again, help us understand how this changes over time. This is a recent paper by Ulrike Felt and her colleague, where they looked at how research integrity was being discussed in the journals of Nature and Science. And they look back till the 1980s and from the 1980s and up until today, and they identified sort of three different ways or three different periods in which research integrity was being talked about in science and nature. And you can see in this first area, it's the family business model is what they call it, where it was thought that the wider society should not be sort of confronted with research integrity issues. This was something that the family scientists and engineers would handle by themselves, so to speak. And scientists, researchers here would be the central actors, because the scientific ethos is something that they nurture and they cultivate. And what they found out here is, looking at the development over time, is that the institutional actors sort of gained in prominence in talking about and discussing research integrity issues. So here in the second model, which is called the institutional extended self model, where it's not only the researchers, they're still central actors, but they're no longer seen as the sole guarantees of research integrity, and the institutional actors gain in importance, whereas the wider society is kind of, there's a fear here that it's losing trust in the science-society relation, or rather it's losing trust in science, and from a scientific point of view that's seen as a concern. And then in the final model, which is, I guess, the model that where I'm operating in, it's the managerial multi-stakeholder self model, institutional actors have been much more prominent in talking about and defining what is research questions, research integrity. And this is not only the universities and research institutions, but also the journals and different kinds of organizations who are involved in those kinds of discussions. And you can see, so they have this dialogical image or icon here, and I think this is actually where I find myself now, is sort of as an institutional actor teaching research integrity to science and engineering PhD students. And I think this is where STS can help make visible how cultures, incentives and pressures shape these judgments about what constitutes responsible conduct in practice, and a role for science STS also to make students aware about this judgment that is needed in order to think about responsible conduct of research. And what they're concluding in this paper is that there is a strong managerial approach to research integrity, and it's really very strong, but they are beginning to see the emergence of awareness regarding the limitations of this model. And there are early indications that a more holistic and care-oriented approach can be considered, aimed at strengthening ethical practices from the future. So rather than viewing integrity as a one-off formality, rules signed off when you enter the field, integrity become a dynamic, continuous process cultivated through everyday interactions, shared reflections, and mutual accountability. I don't know whether this is entirely true, but it's at least a place where STS, I think, can also make a contribution to make that shift happen. So, summing up, teaching research integrity from an STS perspective, it includes, of course, individual compliance and decision making, but it's also an institutional reflections on the cultures, incentives and policies and rules that shape responsible conduct. And I think STS encourages a deliberation about the assumptions, norms and pressures that influence the judgments that are at stake here. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes for the last point I want to make, and this is the role of STS in the shaping of science and technology. So you all know that social shaping of science and technology became kind of a buzzword for STS way back, but I think now STS has also matured to a level where it can take a more active role in this actual shaping of science and technology. Not the least because contemporary challenges are knowledge problems, but they're also coordination problems. And if you can say that in research integrity, universal principles are not enough to transform research into a more responsible, to guide research on a more responsible path, you can also say that knowledge here is not enough to help us solve these grander problems. So I would say that STS, this is my main point again, it does not only contribute knowledge about science and technology, but also help coordinate actions across disciplines, organizations, and forms of expertise. So translation in the STS meaning, where it means both material and semiotic or meaning, transformation and transportation, is a way of enabling collective action. It's a way of, STS I think can play a role in enabling dialogue and negotiations across disciplines and sectors. And I think its contribution, again this is an STS argument, its contribution will vary necessarily with the local opportunity needs and institutional settings. And I can just, again, take up the three contexts that I'm involved in. So in the Space Center, what we're currently discussing, as I said, is a new, let's say, organizational model and a new framework for how the space research and engineering should be done at Aarhus University. And I think what we contribute there is guidance and let's say, informed judgments about what are the best paths to take for a science for a space center. Currently also developing, as some of you also mentioned, some policy documents that can be sent out to the stakeholders in the environment of the space center, and on top of, or in relation to this, I think it's important also to develop sort of our own, let's say, research trajectory within the Space Center. This is what we're doing with the Space Diplomacy and Technological Sovereignty group, where we are developing these issues. In the Quantum Campus Aarhus, I think coordination here means is different from the one that I described in the Space Center, because I think here what the role of STS is, or at least the role of our center, is not so much to help the quantum campus think about new paths and so on, but it's rather to inspire that kind of more, let's say, discussion around the social and wider implications of quantum technologies, and to open up the eyes of other researchers that this is a discussion that can be had and should be had, and it's important for the field going forward. And finally, Helene also mentioned that, and I think public outreach is a crucial point also for STS, something where we can actually also intervene in larger discussions around what science and technology become. I've talked very much from an institutional point of view, so thinking about what is our role at Aarhus University and what is it that we do. But when I think about interventions in or papers in the newspapers and contributions to interviews, and lately I've been involved in this new book about the Carlsberg Foundations, and it was thought of as an anniversary book. So in a sense, it's a kind of a, let's say, a more of a branding exercise. But I thought it would be very nice actually to help Carlsberg Foundation think about their concept of basic research, because it's very much what they would like their brand to be. We sponsor basic research. But I thought this book could actually help them think that about the heterogeneity of basic research, because when you look back and see the projects they've sponsored all kinds of different projects. I mean, some of them, and the concept of basic research is here sort of, let's say, at least up for discussion. What is it exactly that it means? So I think this is what we can also do as STSers. So let me just come back to the topic of teaching, and this is where I will also close. So what is it exactly that we contribute in terms of the teaching? It's been very inspiring for me to see and hear all the things that you're doing here at STS, and I will certainly take some of it back. And I think one of the things that I hear, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, is that we are thinking about teaching STS beyond theories and concept, but really also cultivating capacities for navigating science and technology. And when I think about my own center again, and look at some of the students, I just have 3 students here from our own program in science studies, I can see that what they're doing with their degree is certainly also going out and intervening in different contexts where science and technology is being planned, where it's being used, where it's being communicated to wider audiences. So we would probably agree that STS matters even more now, given the fact that we live in highly scientific and technological societies that struggle around questions of trust, legitimacy, responsibility, and coordination. And we find ourselves in a situation where knowledge and innovation is not enough to help us navigate these complexities. So we need to think about perspective judgment and translations in new ways, and this is where I think STS adds something to not only the discussion, but also to the direction that we are heading in terms of education, by cultivating the capacity for shaping scientific and technological futures, for research, strengthening the reflexive and responsible knowledge practices, for innovation, supporting more inclusive, legitimate, and socially socially desirable futures. So I'll end with this conclusion to my talk, and I thank you very much for having the patience to listen to me rambling on about STS and what it can do. I'm sure you would agree to some of it, perhaps also disagree. But I think the future of STS lies not only again in producing more knowledge about what science and technology is and what it works, but really also to cultivate the capacities needed to shape science and technology going forward. So thank you very much.